We're here today at the Tower Homestead in Twentyninepalms, California with Dona Tower Schutz to give us a little bit of history behind the homestead and what she remembers about the homestead. Dona, when did you first come out here?
Well, I was probably not quite two, and my godmother, who was one of the Reed Tobacco, married to one of the Reed Tobacco sons, and was very wealthy, and she didn't care where her chauffeur took her as long as it was interesting. And for some strange reason, this was in 1929, he brought her to Twentyninepalms. And it was from I-10, which wasn't I-10 then, all the way in was dirt road, single way dirt road, driving around rocks and whatever. And she stayed at the inn, which was there at the Oasis. And for some reason, she's from Virginia, never had been in the desert, and she fell in love with it. And nothing would do, which my dad and mother should come out and see it. And she was my mother's godmother as well. So back we came to Twentyninepalms. And I sincerely feel that my father was a frustrated pioneer. And he just fell in love with the place. And then he found out you could homestead 160 acres with no cost other than you're putting in your time, and you had to put a certain improvement. So he was with General Electric in Pasadena at the time, and they weren't suffering as far as the depression was concerned because he had a good job. And Pasadena was a very affluent area. So, but he had it in his head. And he found this home, it was over 100 years old, that they were going to tear down. So he bought it and tore it down. And he trucked all of that wood that is our home out in I guess it was a Model A truck, up through the grade, again, all dirt road. And I don't know how many trips he took, and that was before the freeways or anything. It was, you went through town after town to get here. And he could have proved up on a homestead right in Twentyninepalms, but he didn't want to. He wanted the wide open spaces. And he and Mother picked out this particular 160 acres. And it's kind of unusual because most of the acreage is square. And this runs a half a mile down the road and a quarter of a mile, or it's either a mile and I don't know what comprises 160 acres, other than I know what ours is. So, and Daddy had the idea he was going to put in a golf course, a desert golf course, which never evolved. And he built the home. Mother and I stayed at that time we were in Altadena. Well, he built the house. And he built a complete house. Most of the people would build one room and a kitchen. And as they could afford it, or if they needed more room, they would just add on. But Daddy built a complete house with the 2 bedrooms and the sun porch and bath and the kitchen. And this big porch. So for a good many years, when they would be holding meetings, they'd use the homestead because it was bigger than anywhere else. And my dad was working for the WPA, and they were putting in the 3 Mile Road, which is the highway now. It was 3 Mile, 2 Mile, and this was 1 Mile Road, Amboy. And as I was saying, my dad would go in and buy meat, and he'd be horrified. Nobody knew what they were doing, and they'd just hack up the side of beef. And he went to Mrs. Bagley and said, "I'd like to take over your meat market." And she said, "Well, it's just here kind of as a convenience. We never make any money on it." And my dad said, "I'll make money." And he did for about 20 some odd years. And going in and out of the refrigerator all the time, it affected his health. So he finally, back in the, I guess probably the early 50s or mid 50s, he had to leave the market. But he certainly made a success out of the market. He had all of anybody that was connected with restaurants came to my dad. And I was in the museum a while back, and they were looking at some pictures, and there was a long line of people lined up on the porch at the plaza, and they wondered what the reason for it. And my dad instituted a meatless Tuesday during the war, World War II. And he just sold bacon that day. And he decided that would be the only day he'd sell bacon. And he'd have long lines of people standing in line waiting to get their pound of bacon. And he was just kind of a fixture. And consequently, so were we, my mother and I. And it was a real experience, I think, being raised out here. I was an only child, and one car, and no telephones. And they didn't get TV until probably the mid-40s.
So what was your average day as a young girl like out here at the homestead?
I read a lot. And I had villages that I created out by the greasewood. And it's funny, we lived with the snakes. In fact, I had a pet snake that lived right in the corner over there. And when I'd come out of the front door, he'd come out of his hole and greet me. And I'd pick him up, and him or her. And he was one of my buddies. And we also had he was about probably 6 feet. I think it was a bull snake. And Mother and I'd be sitting out on the porch in the sun, and he'd come out and stretch out next to us in the sun. And if anybody turned in on the highway, off the Amboy Road, he'd go get in his hole. But when we were just here by ourselves, he was perfectly comfortable being out with us. And he would keep all of the little critters under control, having them for dinner, and also the sidewinders. The sidewinders are about the only poisonous snake that we had. I remember one day my dad was parking under the side of the porch, and he said, "Don't get out." And of course, I was probably 7 or 8 years old, and I didn't know why, so I got out. And when he pulled up on the porch, there was a sidewinder that had been curled up in the shade. But Mother and Dad never made me afraid of anything like that. They just very calmly pointed out what they were and what they did and avoid them. So we did. We came home one night, got out, my grandfather was living here with us then, and he came to the kitchen door with the lantern, and here was this great big sidewinder curled up right in the doorway. So you just learned where you put your feet. And you also looked where you put your feet. And I do to this day. People will say, "How did you notice that?" I said, "Because I'm looking down." I'd pick up money and whatever. So it was a different way of life, but it was a good. And with Daddy having the meat market, we would go in frequently in the evening and pick him up from work, take him home. So there was a certain amount of social life.
What do you remember Twentyninepalms being like back then?
Well, when we moved here, there were 300 people. And they were mainly people with health reasons. In fact, Mr. Bagley, Frank Bagley, was one of the ones that had lung problems. And he was hale and hearty out here. He did wonderfully. And they'd go back down. They were from Pasadena, I'm pretty sure. And a great many Pasadena people seem to end up, well, because of Dr. Lucky, some of it. So it was an interesting group of people. And then we had the miners. And they were a different breed. But what was interesting, they were kind of, in some ways, the flower children of the 30s. This one man was a miner. He was a mining engineer. And he lived in this little cabin, perfectly happy. And it turned out his family was very wealthy from the East. And they wanted him to come home, and he was no interested in going back and being in the crowds. And his whole inside of his house was lined with classics. They referred to the miners, many people, as, kind of dumb people, but they weren't. They were very interesting. And my mother would visit with them a lot at the post office, which was right there at Bagley's as well, now called the Plaza. And it was, so there were kids always at that area, so I had them to play with. And I started first grade. They didn't have a kindergarten. And at that time, when I started school, we had 2 rooms. And I was only 4. But they put me in first grade. I guess I could handle it, and did. And wonderful, wonderful teacher, Mrs. Hardy. She was such a talented woman. I believe she was here because of her husband's health again. And then we got this other woman that was teaching. And I never, ever enjoyed her or got along with her. And fortunately, I never had her as a teacher. But you learn to be very independent. And I moved into Long Beach my senior year of high school, so I could get into college. And there were 1,000 in my graduating class. And if I hadn't wanted to do it and hadn't been such an independent person, it would have been horrible for me. And I knew one other girl in the whole school who had lived here in 29Palms. And I graduated and then went on to City College. And then I married, started a family with Robin, and my second daughter Leslie, and my youngest Becky. And we would drive, we had a men's store in Long Beach, and we lived in Orange County, which was probably about 20 minutes away. And when I drive into the store in the morning, Long Beach only had, it had a kind of a solid smog. And Orange County had about 3 or 4 layers. And I drive home at night and I think, oh, it's awful, the smog. And so finally I decided, why was I living there in a lovely home with a pool and when I could be out here with the girls and fresh air? And so we decided to move back. And it was a wonderful place for them. They were 10, 12, and 14 when we moved back. And it was very good. We opened a women's clothing store. And it wasn't my store, it was our store. And they were wonderful. They were good sales girls. In fact, the principal asked Robin, what can you do? And Robin looked at him and said, I can run a clothing store. And she could. They helped me buy. And they could run the store without my being there. They were very comfortable with it. And I had a lady come in one day and she says, is that little blonde girl your daughter? And Becky was about 11 or 12 then. And I said, yes. She said, well, I came in your store looking for a white pleated skirt. And she realized she didn't have one in my size, so she immediately changed me to something else. And she said, I ended up spending $300. And she says, I loved everything she picked out. She said, I went home and told my husband, he said, you're not going to believe this. So it was a wonderful experience for them. And they became very independent and all have their own businesses. And Becky was 19 when she opened her own store in Yucca Valley at the Vaughn Shopping Center. And she did very well with it. So, and she now is the, special events person. She plans all the special events for Prescott, the city of Prescott. And she's, there are different events that they'd hold. They'd have maybe 300-400 people. And Becky, with the fireworks, I guess it was 4th of July, she built it up to where they have 5,000 and 6,000 people coming now. So she's doing well there. And my middle daughter lives in Virginia Beach, Virginia, and I'm back there with her now. And she opened right during when the bottom was falling out of everything. She opened a antique store with collectibles and very, very interesting gifts. And she's done beautifully with it, even during all of the problems. So, they had a good background in the beginning and they've used it through the years. And all, I think, because of living in 29Palms and learning to be independent.
And Robin, she still has a store here in the historic plaza.
She's had stores in every part of town and a restaurant. She had started out with a steakhouse And Robin, by 8 o'clock at night, she's ready for bed. So the steakhouse was a little bit much for her. So she took over a little restaurant in town and turned it into a cafe. And she had a very good clientele. And people still come up to me and say, oh, I wish Robin's restaurant was still open. So, but
She's got a very nice place now at the Cowboy Attic.
Yes. And Robin does catering. And now she's with the Homestead. She and Manuel have done wonderful things here. I was burglarized, in the about mid-'80s. And I'd never had a fence, I had a small fence in the back, so my dog was closed up when I was gone. We never locked anything. The keys were always left in the car. I don't have a key to any doors. And when I was burglarized, I came home and I looked, and there were some things that were kind of out of place. Then I began to walk around, and you see all the things that I have, and they had, I guess, looked inside the house and decided to go in. They broke a window to get in, and the doors were unlocked. All they had to do was open the door and walk in. And I was rather upset with the sheriff. He said, well, if you don't know who it is, Donna, there's not much we can do. And I thought to myself, well, so I made a list of everything all of the antiques and everything they had taken. And I went around to all the antique stores from Morongo on in to 29 and left a list of what had been stolen. And I stopped at this funny little place, Sibs, and he had a collection of you wouldn't believe. And his wife would say, let's straighten this up. And he says, no, people like it like this. And I was talking to him, telling him I'd been robbed. And he said, is that your purple glass over there? And I looked over and I said, yes. And he knew the woman, knew where she lived. So he called me later that day and he said, well, I have the name. And poor Sib was on probation for receiving stolen goods. He never checked anything anybody bring in. He'd just buy it. And so he said, I kind of hate to get involved. I said, I know. Just give me the name, and since if you can just verify that you had the glass. So he did, and sheriffs, I called them and told them who she was and where she was. And they went out and picked her up, and sure enough, she's just been out here helping herself, which was sad. So then I put up a fence, chain link, and I hated it. I finally reached the point where I didn't see it anymore. I just blanked it out. But Manuel and Robin took that down and had this wonderful fence put in with the railroad ties, and it blends so beautifully with the place. And then they added the pool and that second patio, and they've done wonderful things. Manuel's rewired and replumbed. The plumbing was from the house that was over 100 years old, and suddenly I noticed a leak, and then it began to spurt out. So I called the plumber, and he insisted that it was connected with the pool or with the well. And I said, we didn't have a well when all that plumbing went in. And I showed him exactly where it was and where it went, but they insisted that it had to go out to the pool, or to the well. But finally, this one little man started digging, and he just followed the pipe, and it went right where I said it was going. And they dug the pipe out, and they said, "Look at this pipe." It had an outer coating, and then 2 or 3 in coatings, and it had lasted all those years. But when I put the well in, the water was hard on pipes. So it finally that one had ruptured. But they couldn't believe it. And I know it was the original plumbing from Pasadena. So things lasted then.
I understand the window right behind you is actually out of the home in Pasadena.
Yes. And the bedroom window as well. And 2 of the windows were taken out when we added the room on the back of the house. So the house has stood up very well, and we've had a lot of earthquakes, but where we're located, we have, you dig down about a foot or 2 and you're in what we call the caliche, and it's a type of adobe, but it is to dig in it, you have to wet it down, and you can dig maybe a foot, you have to wet it some more and dig another foot. And I'd have different repairmen and such, and they'd be digging, and they'd say, how did you do, your father do all of this digging? It was a shovel. So anyway, I think my theory is that because of the ground here and not getting, and our water level is about 200 feet here, 300 for Goodwill, that the caliche is so solid. And also, people, when they would build a house, for some reason, they didn't put a slab down right away like they do now. And so we were on dirt floors for a while. And when we had Mr. Bird come out to put the floors in, my dad had dug out in the house, he dug it ready for the cement to be poured. And Walt Berg looked and he said, "Herb, you have the dimensions of a 4-lane highway." And Daddy looked at him and he said, "Just pour the cement." So our floors are about this deep. So I think that keeps it nice and steady too, because we don't have we've never had any problems with any of the earthquakes. No breakage. The last really big one that we had, Adam and I were, no, I was back. It was after Adam had died. I was back visiting Leslie in Virginia Beach. And we were sitting there listening to the news, and they announced that Southern California had an earthquake, a 7 point whatever. And Leslie and I looked at each other. Then they announced in the Landers Twentyninepalms area. And Leslie had her home up for sale. She said, "Oh, there goes my sale." And so I called and had a friend come over and check the house, and nothing. Even the pictures were not crooked. So I think my father chose a good spot, good safe spot. And he happened to know what dry washes were too, which a lot of people did not know. And they'd build right in the middle of one. And it doesn't rain that often, but when you have a bad rain, it can really fill up those washes. And Mojave Road, everything drains down from the mountains, and it's a roaring river down Mojave, which is right there on the side of the house. So we've never had any trouble with flooding. And being out here with the view of the mountains, without being right on top of them, it's a beautiful area, I think. And I had a bed and breakfast for years, and the people they'd come out, a lot of business men and women, and a lot of the movie industry. They'd be just as tight as, and you could see them, visually see them beginning to relax. And they'd have all these plans. They were going to rush here and rush there, and 2 or 3 hours later, they'd still be sitting here on the porch, relaxed. And I said, that's the whole idea of the bed and breakfast, is to give people places to relax. Which they did, and I had a thriving business for over 20 years here. After my second husband had died, I was sitting here and thinking, what am I going to do with all this room? And we had done some bed and breakfast visits and had enjoyed them. And I thought, well, maybe I might do that, not knowing how to start it or what to do. And about 2 or 3 months later, I was volunteering at the chamber, and the man actually was the secretary, had called. The auto club was making a bed and breakfast book, and wanted to know if we had any bed and breakfasts. And I said, no, and that's funny that you would get me on the phone. I said, I've been kind of thinking about doing it. So the man that was in charge came out, and he went through the house with me and gave me some suggestions and said he thought it would be a very nice place for people to come. And my first 2 couples were from hell. And I thought, what am I doing? And then I figured out I should start really kind of interviewing them, since if I'm going to have them in my home. And if I didn't like their sound, if they were whiny or whatever, I'd just say, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't notice, I'm busy, I'm full. And after that, every guest was wonderful. I didn't have one that I would have not wanted to come. And we had a lot of German visitors. And they'd like to come in the summertime. And I'd try and discourage them. Oh, we love the heat. And I say, all right, but one complaint and out you go. And they'd be sitting out here, it'd be 102 in the sun. Just think it was wonderful. And I always served their breakfast out here on the porch. And we were sitting here one day with a lovely couple. Their son was a doctor at one of the large hospitals, and they were over visiting him. And he had somehow or other had been here at the house and had encouraged his folks to come out and stay, and they did. And we were sitting out in the sun. And she turned to me and says, how many days do you have like this? And I said, oh, about 360. And she said, we have about 6. So after investigating it, I found that their weather is not very good. And the only were Japanese. I never had anyone from Japan. And I was talking to one of the fellows from the park, and he said they're scared to death of snakes, and they very seldom do they come out to the desert. So I guess that's the reason I never had one. I had some people from China.
How many guests would you say have stayed at the homestead?
When I first started out, I have just the 2 rooms that I rented, and I had converted the garage for my stepmother when she was ill, and after she died, I heard my 3 daughters all discussing who was going to have the garage, and I said, "I am." "You?" They'd never even considered me, and it was wonderful. I could go out there, they'd play their radios and music, and I could go out there and have peace and quiet. So it worked out beautifully, because I actually wasn't in the house with them, so they felt they could relax and enjoy the house. And so then, instead of renting to 2 separate families or whatever, a lot of times people would come out with 2 or 3 couples, and they would stay. And if I just had one couple coming out, I didn't have anyone else. So I could spend time with them and tell them about the desert. And I was telling this one couple, and he had spent the whole morning going around rearranging things in the house, photographing. And I said, "What are you doing?" He says, "Oh, it's fascinating, just wonderful." He was having a wonderful time. And I was telling him they ought to go down to the museum and go through it. It was interesting, and it all pertained to the area. And he said, "A museum? You're living in a museum." And they spent most of the time right here. They became repeat. I had a lot of repeat guests, and they were one of them. In fact, they were from Riverside. So, met a lot of interesting people, and they kept in touch. And one gal wrote for the New York Times and a lot of different magazines, interesting magazines. And she wrote a piece for the New York Times, the Sunday edition, about the homestead. And that morning, when it came out, being 3 hours ahead of us, I started getting phone calls at 5:30 that morning, making reservations. I couldn't believe it. And that really opened up another big field for me. So, and it was all word of mouth, except for being in the bed and breakfast with the Auto Club. That's the only place I advertised. But I've always been healthy. And to this date, I'm still, I don't get the flu. I don't have flu shots. I don't advertise that. But I had none of the childhood diseases, and I was exposed over and over again, but I just never contracted them. I had mumps when I was 18, and I had chicken pox when I was 30. So it's been a wonderful place to live.
Well, Donna, I appreciate you taking the time to give us some history on the homestead, and it was nice talking to you today.